Our instant reactions to NFL Week 5 as we approach Monday Night Football here as we record this on Monday, the 7th of October. Lots of interesting things to talk through. And what was a fascinating week, Shawn, from a number perspective is one of the things I joked with you before we started recording was that each time I looked at my screen yesterday, it felt like there was a blocked field goal or there was a defensive back, taking it 90 yards to the house on some of these plays. So it was scoring, but there was also quite a bit of defensive scoring in that. Another thing that has been a feature of the season so far is underdogs winning. The underdogs with a 7 or more point line heading into the games this season, there's been 9 times that there's been a line bigger than 7 points. They are now 7-2 outright, the underdogs in those situations. Crazy. So we did have that this week with the Giants. We also had it with the Cardinals. So it is interesting to see how some of these things are playing out. And the other thing, Shawn, I'm going to highlight this off the top. I don't know if it became a point of reference for you during these games, but the unsportsmanlike penalties for the finger pointing on first downs, or they took it up as it was going to be for gun-related taunts, but there was quite a few 15-yard unsportsmanlike conduct penalties yesterday, which were absolutely outrageous, I felt, in the grand scheme of things. But let's talk about the positives.
This is one where you can't shoot a gun after you do anything on the football field. So stop
shoot the cannons.
I mean, the players in week 4 were doing it across the board, and they were getting penalized for it, and they all seemed surprised, and then they come back out in week 5 and do it again. I have absolutely no sympathy. I would be fine with it being like a 30-yard penalty, and the guy's got to sit for a quarter. Because, I mean, this is like dealing with 6-year-olds.
Well, we're not going to go off the rails here. I feel like this is one that could... the Josh Down one, Shawn, he does the standard point. It goes back 15 yards. But we will talk through some of the games. We have a number of games on the chart here that we are going to highlight on today's show. And there's a couple of different ways we could go through it. But the one that I think might be most interesting for the listeners could be looking at the Colts and the Jaguars in terms of the performance that we've seen again from Brian Thomas and the way that he has worked throughout the start of the season here and those opening weeks, and what we think moving forward for him in terms of the dynasty outlook, the season-long outlook, and, I guess the Trevor Lawrence bounce back spot I mentioned a couple of weeks ago. I think he was up to 8 losses in a row at that point. I believe we were at 9 at this point. He gets the win there now, 1-4. He does have 371 passing yards in this, Shawn. The Colts defense not doing a lot to prevent the Jaguars moving the ball. We have 126 rushing yards for the Jaguars, with Tank Bigsby having 13 carries, 101 yards, 2 touchdowns. He ran that backfield rather than Travis Etienne, so I'm interested in your thoughts on that. But Brian Thomas had 8 targets, 5 receptions, 122 and a touchdown, one of those being an 85-yard touchdown, which I believe he may have been the fastest ball carrier in the NFL this season to this point on that particular reception. We also get Alec Pierce, 3 for 134 on 3 targets with a touchdown. It was interesting the way this game was playing out. It looked like the Jaguars with a long Tank Bigsby touchdown had kind of sealed this one, and then Joe Flacco decides that he's going to have 2 kind of 60-plus yard scoring drives that are going to last 3 plays each, and just go in the end zone to put up those 14 points. So I thought that was fun as well. Joe Flacco throws the ball 44 times, has 359 yards and 3 touchdowns. Pretty fun plays on the Colts side as well. They did struggle a little bit more in the run game in this one. But Shawn, Brian Thomas, Tank Bigsby, outlook moving forward for these 2 guys?
Yeah, it's fantastic, right? Because the Jaguars, I mean, they might be the worst team in the NFL, despite Trevor Lawrence, despite that big new contract that he has. And yet we do think that they can probably move the ball. And that 1-2 punch at running back, Travis Etienne gets 7 targets, goes 6 for 43. That's, the silver lining there for his fantasy managers. We kind of backed off Etienne this season because Bigsby in year 2 was one of the elements that we did talk about, where last season, Charbonnet and Bigsby both overvalued this season, both undervalued this really the year where you would kind of expect them to come on if they did. There was no guarantee that they would, but there was definitely that risk in both situations. Certainly Bigsby, he's not just putting up the numbers, but there are some really good runs in here. That 65-yard touchdown run, he has a change of direction that you don't see that often, and certainly is the catalyst for the play. Now, you want to be able to get through the line. The Colts run defense. The Colts defense is apocalyptically bad. I don't know that I've seen a team play this poorly on both against the pass and the run in a long time. You could make the claim that maybe the Washington Commanders are similarly bad. They are hilariously 4-1, and Deshaun Watson threw for 125 yards against them yesterday. I'm going to take back my original note about the Jaguars and say any team that Deshaun Watson is playing for is definitively the worst team in the NFL. But no, Bigsby looked really, really good in this game. I think that we're going to see a lot of him going forward. And then Brian Thomas, you mentioned the speed there. That was something that was on display with all of those long touchdowns last year in college. It was something that was on display at the Combine. One of the reasons why we've made some comments that the gap between Odunze and Thomas, especially when you consider Thomas as the younger player, probably coming in not as large as it seemed for a lot of people. And then certainly now contextually, Thomas is just way ahead of Odunze. We don't necessarily know that he's better per se, but within this context where you have Trevor Lawrence, where he's the obvious number one, where you can attack deep, I mean, he's just rocketed up the dynasty rankings, even though he was pretty aggressively valued to start with coming off of that last season. When you think about what he did a season ago, what Malik Neighbors did, what those guys are doing right now, it's almost a surprise that LSU ever failed to score a touchdown on any possession in the entire college season last year. Now, they were very, very good, and Jaden Daniels' numbers were obviously fantastic. The runaway Heisman winner. Colm, as I was watching the Commanders yesterday, I was thinking to myself that the Bears are going to regret not picking him number one for the next 15 to 20 years. But at the same time, Caleb Williams was playing a fantastic game. I think both of those franchises are going to be pretty happy. The other teams that needed or took a QB, maybe in a little bit of a different situation, certainly the Patriots, I mean, I understand what they're doing, and maybe it's going to be the thing that works out for them. But certainly when you're seeing what the number one and number two picks are doing to elevate their teams, I'm sure Patriots fans are, number one, mostly just disappointed that you end up, not with one of the first two picks, but then also just frustrated that they're having to be so patient as you kind of go through the season. You look at that game yesterday from Sam Darnold there in London, where, and this is the first game where it's like, yeah, this is what Sam Darnold is. Now they can scheme him out of that most of the time, probably, but you face a good pass defense like the New York Jets, and he's bad. And so you're thinking for next season, like, how do we get to where we're a legitimate Super Bowl contender? Now, obviously, the Vikings 5-0, a lot of the other teams sort of melting down around them. You have that loss yesterday that you referenced from the San Francisco 49ers. That's one where, now you're really starting to think maybe this is Lions, Vikings for the whole thing in the NFC, certainly as it relates to playoff seeding. There's a long, long way to go. Those teams can lose 2, 3, 4 games fairly quickly if things go wrong. When you think about J.J. McCarthy there, Colm, the other kind of vague side note that's sort of interesting, you got a lot of feistiness from Bo Nix yesterday. You actually got a very good game for him. The first half, not that great, but then as they pull away, he looks absolutely fantastic. You think about those best ball portfolios, and I mean, we love Troy Franklin. That was maybe one of the worst efforts on a long potential touchdown pass that I've ever seen. Not like from an effort perspective, but from an execution perspective, where it's not just a drop, but despite having apparently plenty of time, he doesn't get his body into the right spot. He doesn't get his hands close enough to the ball. So he doesn't get there first. The body control was very poor. The ball tracking was very poor. And then he does have his hands on it and doesn't catch it. all of that was disappointing. You add those numbers on to what Bo Nix did in that game, and suddenly, I mean, he's looking very, very good. The Broncos are for real, in part because of that defense. But Colm, I've been all over the place here as you asked me this question
all over the
about
place.
Brian Thomas. And I mean, the main thing here, 34 passes from Trevor Lawrence. I mean, I'd love to see more than 8 targets. I think they have to get him even more involved. Now, he did also actually have a meaningful gain that was called back on a penalty. So that would have added a 6th reception.
Yep.
I mean, I think that we're looking at a second half of the year where he's consistently going over 10 targets a game. You're not going to always have an 85-yard touchdown in there, but he's going to have a really good season. I think he's already on that wide receiver 1 border.
Yeah, so in terms of, rookies historically over their first 5 games, the first round rookie wide receiver, so only looking at the first round guys that have had 80 plus PPR points in those first 5 games: Chase, Lamb, AJ Green, Odell Beckham, Calvin Ridley, Malik Neighbors, and Brian Thomas. Interesting that obviously 2 of them are through this first portion of the season. We will see how that continues, but I've been very impressed on that speed that, again, I mentioned, but you also mentioned, very, very impressive when you see that against other NFL athletes. We are going to go, though, Shawn, to the Broncos game because you did mention part of that, so we'll jump into that now. But I do think it's a bit harsh on the Darnold side of things. We kind of thought that he may have struggled throughout the season. He has a bad game against a good defense. I think that he is still enough of a game manager in that situation that the Vikings will continue to be good for the rest of the season. I think
they're going to be good because their defense is good, and because they have. I think offensively
they'll be good.
But he was awful in this game.
He was, but so was Aaron Rodgers, and we're not going to talk specifically about that game. But I'm a big Aaron Rodgers, truther. I'm an Aaron Rodgers stan. But yeah, I'm very, very concerned about how far we're going here with Rodgers down the line. Some really poor play from a quarterback who that just used not to be something that we would see from him. But moving in, Shawn, you mentioned the drop for Troy Franklin. He does have just the 1 reception for 20 yards. That would have been a deep touchdown. I thought one of Bo Nix's best throws that we've seen from him, going down the field. It was interesting, this one as well. You've seen him and Sean Payton, and I didn't get to see any kind of communication after the game as to what it was about. They were heated a couple of times on the sideline about different things. He also has the Russian touchdown in this, which is not really a Russian touchdown. It's the old Drew Brees hop over the line play. So he does get that short play. But again, when you're factoring in Bo Nix and some of the upside as we move through the rest of the season, you have to factor in like that is a play in the Sean Payton playbook if he trusts you to do it like he did with Drew Brees a lot of times throughout their career. He has 206 passing yards, 2 touchdowns through the air, no interceptions, 19 of 27. Does take 3 sacks for 26 yards, and there is still some concerns with some of the plays that we're seeing from Nix. But again, if you take out the kind of Jaden Daniels equation, rookie quarterbacks are going to have some things throughout those opening weeks of the season. I think we're seeing them get better, even during games at certain points. I thought Javonte Williams looked pretty good in this one, some of his carries, but he goes 5 for 50 through the air. But the tricky thing, Shawn, when you look at this from the Broncos perspective, we're talking about the drop, but like this is 19 targets or 19 receptions, 26 targets spread around dramatically around the offense. We get 6 targets to Williams, 5 to Sutton, 2 to Humphrey. Troy Franklin gets the 2. Troutman gets 1, Josh Reynolds gets 2. There's 1 to a bunch of guys, including Marvin Mims, and then McLaughlin got 4. But it's a very spread out passing game. There's not anything that's really standing out to you as, a truly high-end wide receiver on the offense. But I thought Nix looked very good. I'll let you give some more thoughts on him in a moment. But on the opposite side, Brock Bowers had 12 targets, 8 receptions, 97 yards, 1 touchdown. He goes for a 57-yard receiving touchdown early in this one. I know he had 12 targets. I know he had 8 receptions. I don't think that they went to him anywhere near enough in this. And there was also a truly terrible Gardner Minshew pick 6 in the red zone that he somehow, Shawn, overthrew a wide open Brock Bowers. I watched it multiple. I don't know how that happened, but then it was returned for a pick six. And I believe it was that play as the games were happening live, and we'll touch on it in a moment, but the Seahawks returned a ball from the goal line for a touchdown as well. I think they must have happened within 10 minutes of real time, but lots of things to look at here, mainly from the Bowers perspective. But the game also seen a quarterback change where Minshew did come out. And while I thought that was a terrible turnover, I didn't think this was actually Minshew's worst performance overall. He was 12 of 17. He had 2 interceptions at that point, but he did have the one passing touchdown, 137 yards. O'Connell came in. He goes 10 of 20 for 94 and an interception. Didn't look great himself. So I don't know if you want to comment on that quarterback room, but the Bo Nix quarterback side is probably more exciting to talk about. But what do we need from that quarterback room to put Brock Bowers from I think he's already like in that elite tier, but to, the high end ceiling that we would like to see from him?
The 57-yard touchdown was both a little bit of defensive ineptitude, but then also,
what the 57-yard touchdown was like? It was like Tucker Kraft, who we're going to talk about in a minute, having a very similar long touchdown.
Tucker Kraft is good. He's going to be
more athletic,
probably the league winner, right? But you look at Brock Bowers and this touchdown pass that was thrown to him where he has a defensive back on him and the ball is just very slightly underthrown. He jumps up and over the defensive back, snatches the ball with 2 hands, like pulls it up and away from the defender, and maintains perfect balance as he goes to the ground and turns upfield. Meanwhile, the defender who had the ball disappear on him is so thrown that as he lands, he then goes to the ground. So there's only one remaining defender out there who has a blocker with him. Bowers up the sideline, able to beat that guy pretty easily. You could see the speed and the after the catch ability in this game. You talk about how it could have been a lot bigger, and it could have, right? You get the 12 targets. There were plenty of other times where he was potentially open. You also had him as the target on 2 of the 3 interceptions that are thrown in this game. You mentioned that he was wide open for a second touchdown, and Gardner Minshew airmails them to the point where it looked like Bowers was going to go up and make a play. And then at the last moment, because he and Minshew were so close together and the ball was thrown so far over his head, he actually pulled his hand down thinking there had to be a teammate behind him, which there kind of was, but it still wasn't going to be. It wasn't to that guy. It was to Bowers. Right, so then you get the pick six there. He also has a play where he goes out along the sideline. Beautiful play design, but Minshew overthrows it by about 5 yards. That play was going to go for about 30. And so you think about the 4 non-receptions on the 12 targets, and 3 of those 4 were game-changing plays for the Raiders because they could have been huge. And on the other hand, they ended up being picks. I think that you're right on the Gardner Minshew side of this, where you do get some egregious throws. The game does turn because they had Bo Nix completely bottled up at the time that he throws that pick six. They're potentially going to go in for a 17-3 lead, which would have been dramatically different. But the thing here is that Gardner Minshew can move the ball. He's averaging over 8 yards per attempt at the time that he's pulled, and Aiden O'Connell can't. And so it's kind of that question of there's no real value to going to the backup once you're already well behind, and your team overall just is not talented enough to go with a game manager to start with. So there's no real fit for Aiden O'Connell. The flip side of that is that if he gets a full week of practice as the starter, if they commit to him for the long term, you're probably going to get some better games than this. But especially in this environment where Jacoby Myers and Trey Tucker are your leading receivers, or they're your wideouts to go with Bowers. And then you have Amir Abdullah. Amir Abdullah had a beautiful 40-yard touchdown run there, but the running back group also very, very weak. It's not a great environment to try and develop someone like an Aiden O'Connell. It's one of the reasons you actually do need to have some talent. It's one of the reasons why, even if you could get some draft compensation and you don't really think that Devontae Adams is a very good team guy and a very good fit with your group at this point on a roster where you're not going to be competitive. I mean, if they don't throw that pick six, maybe the Raiders are 3-2, right? And at the very least, you want to be developing something this year by going with this group at quarterback. They made the comment, we're not going to reach for a guy who can't play and blow a first-round pick that way and put ourselves even further behind by having someone that, A, we've wasted a pick on, and B, then you got to play and prove whether or not he can do it for a long time. But they've unfortunately entered this season, and they just have so little talent on offense that there's nothing to build here. This is mostly just a thrown away season outside of whatever Brock Bowers can do for fantasy.
Yeah, so we'll see. Yeah, it's unfortunate. And I also thought it was a little bit strange on the road in that situation to make the quarterback change, but obviously the coaching staff thought that it was the right thing to do. It just was one where sometimes you're watching a game and you think like this is leading towards it. It felt like it was quite sudden as that one was happening. Shawn, the Cardinals were one of the teams on the road that got a win against the San Francisco 49ers as an underdog. This one looked like, it was going to be kind of cozy enough for the 49ers as we enter halftime. It's 23-10. And then the 49ers don't score in the second half. They do have an unfortunate injury to their kicker on a kickoff return where he twists his ankle pretty badly. And then they have a situation where they do put over a kick after that, but then there was certain points where they went for it on fourth down. I believe there was a 4th and 23 that they went for it as well. That would have been a makeable field goal. So there was some challenges here for the 49ers in this one, but I was quite impressed, Shawn, with how the Cardinals managed to work their way back into it. The highlight play, I think, for the entire game is probably the Kyler Murray rushing touchdown. He goes for 50 yards, and when he's run about 10 of those yards, he, already is celebrating. He's like, nobody's catching me on this one. I have, talked about Murray so far this season with his struggles. He had struggles again in the passing game here, 19-30 for 195, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. But Shawn, in our Guillotine League this week, he was somebody that I picked up relatively cost effective. I also could have just started Bo Nix, who was on my bench, Shawn, in that league. That would have worked kind of relatively similar. But I was very happy when I seen him take off for that rushing score from that perspective. We get Trey McBride, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 53. He didn't look like he was at 100%, Shawn, in this one. He also had an end zone target from Kyler Murray in this one, which I think he really should have came down. Well, he's kind of stretching for it and just can't pull it in. James Conner has 86 yards on the ground in this particular game, 14 yards in the air on 2 targets. Does look, to get some pretty hard yards as they go down the stretch here. I thought Purdy looked pretty good in the first half. He struggled a lot in the second half. He ends up 19-35 for 244, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. We get George Kittle into the end zone. Brandon Aiyuk, Shawn, looked as good as he has this season so far. And the opposite obviously can be said of Deebo Samuel. Samuel just had the 3 targets, 1 reception, 11 yards, but Aiyuk had 12 targets, 8 receptions, 147. He did have over 100 of those, I believe, in the first quarter. So they just kind of struggled immensely from halftime onwards. What were some of your key takeaways in this one? We've talked about Aiyuk, coming into training camp, looking for the contract, all the things that went on there. Interestingly enough, this might have been the week that people who sat out, started to play. We've seen that with Jamar Chase, obviously, this week as well. What were some of your key takeaways from this contest?
You can't afford to give up the big special teams plays. And yet, this is one reason why you would always kick off, into the end zone. It's one of the reasons why if you do kick off in the field of play, you would just tell your kicker, run the other direction, because they lose this game due to that kicking injury. Now, you got to give the Cardinals a lot of credit for what they did to battle back, but this game should not have been competitive. And it's a super weird one, Colm. You mentioned it as a game where the underdog by a touchdown plus wins, and that was despite the fact that they gave up a special teams touchdown against. You're not expecting a huge underdog to pull off the victory when they have that type of play against them. They're setting up for a field goal to make it 13-all. Instead, it gets blocked and returned, and suddenly you're staring down the barrel at 20-10. They make arguably some mild adjustments in that Brandon Aiyuk had 90 in the first quarter. He went over 100 early in the second quarter, only finishes with 147. Once they were able to slow him, they slowed the 49ers, which was a bit surprising. You mentioned those 2 interceptions from Purdy, at least one of which he gets contacted on, I believe, as he throws it. But there wasn't the overall awareness from him that we've come to expect. And that's been a little bit of the theme early in this season, where teams have managed to speed the 49ers up just a tad. Jordan Mason has looked fantastic, and yet the offense itself hasn't been as seamless as it is with Christian McCaffrey. Mason averages over 6 yards per attempt, but he commits what ends up being a back-breaking fumble. So you get the special teams touchdown against the Cardinals, but they do force 3 turnovers from the 49ers. That, along with those situations, as you mentioned, where the 49ers have to go for it because they can't kick a field goal, creates this environment where the Cardinals are down 2, and they were down 2 because they had gone for 2 when they got to the point where you can just kick the extra point to go down 3. I thought that was a fantastic move there. So you get within 2, then you score at the end to win this game. From a fantasy perspective, Colm, it was kind of interesting because Murray, again, really did struggle as a passer. And they got to the point where they're trying to finish off this comeback, and they go back to James Conner, even though the 49ers know what's coming. It's not a game that leaps off the page from Conner's perspective. It's not a great fantasy performance from him. But from a reality perspective, the way that he battled there on that drive down the stretch was just pretty crazy. He looked absolutely fantastic. It's something that they can lean on. They were able to get Michael Wilson open. That's not really the way probably they're hoping to do it, certainly the way fantasy managers are hoping to do it. We talked about Brian Thomas earlier. You don't want to overreact, but Marvin Harrison doesn't look good. He doesn't look fast out there. He doesn't have any rapport with Kyler Murray. A lot of the targets that he gets are sort of low value, toss it up to him targets where the defender is there, and then he's got to make the play through contact. You don't really want a bunch of contested catches for him. You want him to be clear in space like Brian Thomas. These were some of the mild concerns that we had about him. One of the reasons that we had Malik Neighbors higher. The season is not done for them, but even in a game here where they pull off the big upset and Murray shows the value of his wheels, right? This is one of the best rushing games in Kyler Murray's career. You're still not seeing it from a passing perspective, and you're not seeing it from Marvin Harrison. So especially with how bad the Cardinals defense is, and this is another one of those teams where the defense is almost not even there, right? So again, with Brock Purdy, you desperately wanted a better performance. They're going to have to score a lot, which means they're going to need Marvin Harrison. They're going to also need Trey McBride. He had an interesting game. If you're in tight end premium, then his score is still fine. But it was disappointing in that he drops one of Kyler Murray's better throws. He drops a touchdown. It was one where it's a little bit of a difficult play. He goes to the ground. He doesn't hold it through the ground. But for Trey McBride, you need to make that. I think that the positive note, though, is that he leads the team with the 9 targets. He looked, I think, more back to his physically dominating self, and coming back off of that concussion, he looked feistier than he did in the first 3 games there, right? So that part, I think, was exciting. He did take what I consider to be a flagrantly dirty hit where D. Winter seemed to square him up and just flagrantly target his head and launch at him. And that was one where you were very nervous as it happened. If he gets a second concussion there, it hurts his season. I don't know that Winters is thinking this guy came off of a concussion so much as I just want to make a big hit. He was definitely flexing afterward. But you'd love to see some.
He just didn't point his fingers, though, Shawn. That was the main thing. That would have drew a penalty.
The lack of concern for other players' safety is still, I think, pretty troubling as we navigate the 2024 season. On the flip side of that, I mean, this was a game and this was a week. You mentioned some of our favorite tight end options really for me, the four kind of big guys are going to be McBride and Bowers and then Kincaid. Ben and I talked about him at length on Ceiling Bananas. He had a chance to have a huge game, and Josh Allen simply didn't make the throws. But they had Dalton Kincaid wide open. I still think he's going to have a pretty good season. But every week that you go and don't really score, your teams are falling further off the pace. The other player here, and probably the guy that we have the most of, is George Kittle. And you think back to the mega tiers and how all that works and how you want to have the last of the elite guys, especially if he's probably the best of all of those players. George Kittle in this one draws the 12 targets. That matches Aiyuk. You think about it compared to Juwan Jennings, who'd been on fire, and Deebo Samuel, who often gets a lot of manufactured work, that those two guys only have 7 combined, and Kittle goes for 12. That part very encouraging. He does score the touchdown, but it's also similar to McBride, similar to Kincaid. It's a case of, on top of that, what might have been, in that he has a really bad drop on what would have been a big game. He has a second drop later, and he has it in some ways similar to the Bowers situation, where he has a second touchdown, and Brock Purdy misses him badly enough that by the time that he contorts his body to make a fantastic catch, he no longer has the angle at the sideline. He's going to be able to catch and walk in if the pass is on target. By the time he makes the catch, he's on the sideline. The defenders have recovered. He goes out at the 1.5, 2 yard line there.
He's getting a lot of end zone targets. Even in this one, there was another one similar to the crazy catch that he had last week in week 4, where he can't make the catch, but on the far side of the end zone. So he's getting like the majority of the looks down there as well, which is very positive for him.
Yeah, this could have very easily been a 30-point game. Hopefully he can go a week without showing up on the injury report. Hopefully Trey McBride can do the same. But when you consider that both of these guys came in questionable, they looked fantastic in this game.
We'll go to a game now, Shawn, where some people didn't look fantastic, and that was the Green Bay Packers and the Rams. I felt like this was an offensive struggle throughout for both sides. Jordan Love may have had the best throw of his career in this game and the worst throw of his career in this game, where he has one where he pitches it off trying to avoid a safety. It ends up being a return for a pick 6, which obviously isn't a heads-up play, but he also has the deep shot to Jaden Reed for 53 yards, which I thought was both an incredible throw, an incredible catch, and also very poor from a defensive perspective in terms of, trying to break up that play. But nice play from the Packers. But Shawn, the talking point here has to be Tucker Kraft. Obviously, coming into the week, there was a lot of hope around Dontavian Wicks. Myself and yourself had him on a main event team, which we had him in the lineup. He has 7 targets, but just 2 for 20. Has some of those issues that have plagued him at his time in Green Bay, where he will make the big plays at times like he did in week 4, but he also will have those drops that he also had throughout the season so far. But in this game as well, some plays where he kind of has to make them. When we're criticizing some of the potential drops so far in the show, there's always going to be a couple of Wicks ones in there that he really has to have. But Tucker Kraft, Shawn, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 88 yards, 2 touchdowns. One of those being the 66-yard run that I mentioned earlier in the show, where he shows good speed down the sideline. He also has that pitch for the second touchdown. And again, I did mention this on last week's show. I feel like I'm going to mention it the rest of the season. We had lots of discussions this offseason where I would have been very much more on the Luke Musgrave side. Shawn was taking the Kraft argument. I did look up as we're recording this one, kind of surprised myself. I have more Tucker Kraft in best ball than I have Luke Musgrave, which I'm quite delighted about when I make this point to Shawn, that he was very much right in terms of how this offense could shake out. And at the moment, it has gone from, I felt that it was Musgrave's, and maybe it goes to like a split between the two, to like Tucker Kraft is the clear tight end in this offense, and he is like, one of the must play tight ends in fantasy moving forward. I think he has a chance to just push himself by the end of the season into that higher end tier. If you look at a tight end then that'll be playing with Jordan Love moving forward, there's just immense upside here for Tucker Kraft. On the other side, Kyron Williams does have 22 carries. He has 102 rushing yards. He has a rushing touchdown. Blake Corum, though, was more involved in this, and this is saying that he had 5 carries for 25 yards, but he was in there in the first half, where we have kind of seen him just basically be null and void throughout the season so far. But Kyron does have the 22 carries there. I just thought that both teams here really struggled moving the ball to be consistent on offense, to try and work it and keep moving the sticks. I think Tucker Kraft shows the takeaway here. If you want to rant and rave about him, had you any other thoughts on how this game played out?
I think you covered that nicely. It's always frustrating when you get the big play and then Josh Jacobs, who again didn't look good, is the beneficiary from a touchdown perspective. But yeah, what about that throw and catch for Jordan Love to Jayden Reed? I mean, Jayden Reed doesn't end up really with that strong of a fantasy performance here compared to what we've gotten used to. But the 53-yard gain is into triple coverage.
Yeah.
And he's the only one of the 4 players who's able to track the ball. In part, that's because you do have an advantage as the receiver, knowing how the route's supposed to work and where the ball should come down. But then the perfectly placed pass that travels the full 50 yards in the air, he comes down with it. You don't get any kind of drop. The ball doesn't move, those types of things. That part was extremely exciting. I mean, this is going to be the Jayden Reed show with then other elements off of it. Sometimes it's going to be Tucker Kraft. He looks fantastic. You mentioned Kraft versus Musgrave. This is one of those where they drafted the athlete first. They drafted the top tight end prospect second. It doesn't always work out that the guy who can actually play ends up being the focal point. But certainly over time, you do like the chances of the guy who's been a good football player to outperform the guy who's been a fantastic athlete. Man, Wicks, catch the ball, right? That part was pretty frustrating. You would have loved.
Shawn, I'm sure you're aware of the I don't know, maybe you aren't. The meme that comes up from time to time from the Moneyball movie, where it's like, this is whoever, he does this, but this is the problem. But it was like, this is Dontavian Wicks. He does all these things, but then the last line was, but he plays football like he doesn't realize you can use your hands. So, we do need consistency there. That is the difference, and the reason that he is, on the depth chart the way he is down to the consistency. I even mentioned against the Vikings where he has, the first touchdown that he had, where like he's kind of fighting to catch the ball in an uncontested catch situation. It may be just something that he might develop it, but I would imagine that it's going to be something that just comes with him.
I guess I'm more optimistic than that. I think that one of the things that we've witnessed from him is a lot of enthusiasm and this push to work his way into a role. And it's kind of one of these things where you get the in-week developments with Romeo Doubs, and part of you is like, okay, well, now this really frees up Wicks. It really frees up Reed. And yet they were already involved, right? There's
going to be some of this, though, that's also on maybe some of the passes or some of the play calls, but like he has 10 receptions on the season on 29 targets. Like that, it's not going to be efficient enough to continuously do this. Like the Packers aren't going to be in situations where...
Right. But I think that you look at a lot of the plays, and I think that there were some inaccurate passes, and then he just seems like a young player who is fighting to make it and has kind of sped up mentally and is trying too hard, as opposed to somebody who can't catch. I think especially when you look at his collegiate track record, I'd be less worried about the catching and more just like, is this going to lead now to them de-emphasizing him, which is harder to do when Christian Watson is hurt and when Romeo Doubs has evidently thrown a temper tantrum and gotten himself, really in trouble here. And one of the things that you liked in this offense, I think, and it's always one of those things where retrospectively you can say, well, yeah, this would have been better or this would have been better. You don't know until you see it. You watch this game here and you're like, I really wish Romeo Doubs was out there sucking up a lot of the low value routes, which was kind of his thing too, where it's like, I didn't want to do that. But allowing these guys to play off of him as opposed to needing to, create more routes for Malik Heath, somebody that I do think can make some plays, for Bo Melton, somebody who actually picked up a lot of places this last week. I think those guys are all right, but I mean, you love for the defense to have to account for Romeo Doubs, even if it's not accounting for him as a big play threat. And then you can use Reed and Wicks off of him. And maybe that won't end up being anything. Maybe it's just that Jordan Love and the Packers didn't play their best game as a road game. I mean, Love still trying, I think, to get back to 100%. You're going to have some blips like this. But they didn't look as dynamic as they've looked. You say that within a game where, partly because of that 53-yard completion, but Love, again, averages over 8.5 yards per attempt. You contrast that with the Rams, as you mentioned, and this was really the first game for me where, I mean, Matthew Stafford looked old. And there were some pretty serious Aaron Rodgers vibes to this, where in addition to the fact that he's playing with, I mean, this is a game where Parkinson draws 13 targets, Atwell 10, Whittington 10. You know that is not ideal, and that having those guys with that kind of target volume, as opposed to it being Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, that's going to be bad. And yet at the same time, there were a lot of throws that came out of his hand where that just simply doesn't look like Matthew Stafford.
I would agree with that point, but you kind of got to the other thing that I was going to mention is you look at the players that are missing, the players that he's making these plays to. There's a huge gulf there from what they were intending to start the season with to what they actually have now, and that's going to be difficult for them to work on offense. But he looks, and we've seen this Shawn kind of season as the season goes on. Some years it does look like the arm strength wears down, and I think it was evident in this game, because I think if this Packers team was playing a team with any way of an efficient offense here, I think they'd lose the game. They were kind of almost doing everything they could to not win it, but the Rams could not take advantage of that.
They couldn't. At the same time, when we're looking for positives or looking for what is fantasy relevant out of this, you mentioned Blake Corum. He did play earlier. He did get a couple of carries on their early touchdown possession where
he got some third down carries as well, short yardage that they went with them on, which that was where I was probably most surprised by where the attempts were coming from.
Yeah, and so much of fantasy, especially when you work into a little bit of a committee, you're talking about who ends up with the key touch. And you hate to root against players, but I mean, that is kind of what sports are about, where he gets the carry from the 4-yard line, gets to the 1, he's out. Back in there, and you're like, please stuff him. That's from my perspective where I have quite a bit of Kyren Williams. They do stuff him. Kyren comes in and gets the touchdown. And I think that contrast sticks in the coaches' heads a little bit. And then on top of that, you have Williams actually looked very good. He has a 30-yard run in this game. He's consistently executing difficult third down conversions where the box is stacked. He carried them as close to victory as he could. And I think that's going to be the main takeaway for the coaches. One of the things we've consistently said is that Blake Corum is not as good as people are saying. He's not going to have as big a role early, and yet simultaneously that they picked him to have a role at some point. And it's very similar to the case with Charbonnet and with Bigsby, where as things go along, he's not going to stay relegated to the bench, right? He's going to play in these games. And so it's always a question of when do we get a little bit of a push into the committee? And Colm, one of the things that has been very interesting, I think, this year is that you could make the argument that everyone outside of potentially Saquon Barkley and Alvin Kamara, and we'll see what the Saints do now that Kendre Miller is healthier, but I mean, Bijan Robinson losing a lot of high-value touches to Tyler Algier. Breece Hall is in a similar situation to Travis Etienne. And one of the things that I look at there is that, you want to ride the hot hand. And Bigsby looked astonishingly good for the Jaguars. And yet at the same time, when you're talking about Breece Hall and Travis Etienne, you're talking about two of the greatest big play backs and two of the best college players in the last, say, 15 years, and they have been very good NFL players. Some of that is a little bit more controversial with ETN, but the problems that he has had have stemmed in such large part to the Jaguars having the blandest run scheme in the entire NFL. Now, the Jaguars are like, well, I mean, if our run scheme is so bad, we'll just put in the guy who can run behind it in Tank Bigsby. My main point here is that I do think that these teams run a little bit of a risk of getting themselves out of the right mindset of, if you're not using ETN and Hall and Bijan Robinson, your team is going to get worse as you go through. But if those guys can lose touches, Kyren Williams can certainly lose touches, even though Kyren Williams is undervalued. So, I mean, Blake Corum, if he's freely available in your league and you don't have some massive roster crunch, I would definitely be stashing him.
The final game, Shawn, we're going to talk about today had some interesting running back usage, and that is the New York Giants and the Seattle Seahawks. The Giants, the other team, winning by being a 7-point underdog on the road. They seal it at the very end with a blocked field goal return for a touchdown. But in this particular one, Tyrone Tracey, Shawn, 18 rush attempts, 129 yards, averages 7.2 yards per carry. It was interesting in this that we did see Eric Gray early in this one. He had 3 receptions for 50 yards and 4 targets, had a drive where he kind of works his way down to the goal line, ends up with just the 4 carries for 4 yards, but does fumble one of those at the goal line. The replays, again, the angles that some of the NFL stadiums have aren't conclusive, and it went with the decision on the field that it was definitely a fumble. I thought it was a pretty close call. But the big talking points outside of Tracey for the Giants have been they went into this one without Malik Neighbors. In that Guillotine League, Shawn, that I did talk about, I picked up Wan'Dale Robinson. You had Darius Slayton in there. Slayton has 11 targets, 8 receptions, 122 and a touchdown, 41-yard long for him. Wan'Dale has 9 targets, 6 receptions, 36 and a touchdown. So both of them stepping up in the absence of Malik Neighbors. On the other side, though, Shawn, the running back game, or the running game, kind of outside of Geno, non-existent for the Seahawks. We get 5 carries for Kenneth Walker. We get 2 carries for Charbonnet, then 4 carries for 72 for Geno. DK Metcalf has a costly fumble in this one. The Giants now 2-3, the Seahawks 3-2. So a pretty big win here, a surprising win on the road for the Giants. Tyrone Tracey, though, comes in this situation. It would have been interesting to see if that fumble that was returned for a 100-yard return touchdown hadn't have happened and Gray gets in there, how that backfield split is the rest of the way then. But I thought Tracey looked really, really good here in this one, as did Slayton. I would expect, though, the usage, to balance back down for the wide receivers when we get Malik Neighbors back in. But how do you think the running backs feature going forward? And do you think this was just a kind of one of those situations for the Seahawks rushing game where they got away from it? Geno does throw 40 times, completes 28 passes. He also gets sacked 7 times for 53 yards. The Giants defensive front has been putting a lot of pressure on the quarterbacks recently. So they get 7 sacks again. What were some of your thoughts on this one?
Well, the number one thought was that
JSN got a touchdown.
I did like that. Colm, I think this was the second consecutive week that I was projected as the low score in our Guillotine League. And then in the early game, I get 6 points from Breece Hall and 6 points from Jordan Addison. And I'm thinking, like, I'm definitely getting chopped, right? If you go in with the worst projection and then 2 of the guys who have a chance to carry you. But Colin, this one was somewhat amusing. I am always working on the 0 RB universe as the bidding deadline comes up for the Guillotine League. And then I always remember, as I'm putting the finishing touches on the article, that, I needed to go bid. The thing that happened last week is that the team that got chopped had like 5 injured players. And so they weren't going to really help rosters a ton anyway. But I went in during the week and picked up Ray McLeod, which is pretty embarrassing. Again, we should note that these are large leagues that, I mean, they're not as large now as we've had some teams chopped. But Ray scores 13 points. This was the second time this season, Colm, that I've picked someone up in a super deep league on Sunday morning, and they carried me because that was Darius Slayton. Without Slayton's 26 points, I would definitely no longer be in this league. It does look like I'm going to make it through. There are sort of 4 teams fighting it out at the bottom. And if Xavier Worthy scores any points, I should be safe. Colm, we wanted to note, can I officially announce 5:30 Eastern Wednesday evening, we will live draft Guillotine Resurrection?
That is very handy because that'll save us having to talk about it after we finish the show today. That was on my to-do list. I was going to send out the email today about it. So yeah, let's go for that as the provisional 5:30 Eastern Wednesday to see if we can get it filled up and see how long we can last the cut match. And we've got through 5 weeks in this one. We're doing pretty good.
Yeah.
I still have no viable running backs in that league, by the way. I'm still waiting to pick up useful running backs.
Your team has done quite well. Colm, it looks like one of the highest scorers again is Shawn's tennis career. I love to see that name, and I love to see it doing well on the leaderboard. Much better than my actual tennis career. Colm, Giants, Seahawks. This was another game where you come in as the big underdog, and then you give up. You think about the swing when you're about to score a goal line touchdown, and then that is returned 102 yards for a touchdown the other way. How can you possibly overcome that? And yet the Giants do. In Eric Gray's defense, he was making a great effort to try and score. I do think it probably was a touchdown, but with it being ruled a fumble, there certainly wasn't the type of evidence you would need to overturn it. But I mean, you feel bad for him because he probably scored, and instead he ends up losing whatever, hold on the job he might have had. But part of that is because Tyrone Tracey was extraordinary in this game. Tracey came in, fantastic athlete. He had some of the best peripherals in college football last year as he transitioned to running back. He was one of our favorite guys. He had started to work into a committee with Devin Singletary already. And so in some ways, it was a mild surprise that Gray came out and was so involved early. But in the passing game, they managed to get him into space. And then there wasn't anything that spectacular that Gray did, but he executed those plays. And that's one of the things as an offense that's missing your starting running back, that's missing a Wan'Dale Robinson. That's what you're looking for, right? You need somebody who's going to execute. I think for me, one of the takeaways is, and again, when we come into all of these games, seeing it through the lens of things that we previously thought, previously said, I think that Daniel Jones is a starting quarterback in the NFL. I don't necessarily think he's a top 15 quarterback. I don't necessarily think that you're that likely to win a bunch of playoff games with him as your quarterback. So anybody who's looking at it from that perspective and saying the Giants still need to get off of this guy if they're going to be what Giants fans want to be, then I can understand that argument. If you're trying to make the case that he's not in the top 30 or he has no business on an NFL field, I guess I would pretty strongly disagree with that. He looked good in this game. He's able to get the ball out to the guys. The passes to Darius Slayton, including the touchdown, are absolutely fantastic in a lot of cases. I think that part of what's happening with Malik Neighbors right now is actually Daniel Jones. And that's not something that people believe whatsoever. But you look at this game without Malik Neighbors and how well he performed and how he's able to elevate someone like Darius Slayton. And Slayton is basically the Dontavian Wicks of the Giants. Slayton is extremely athletic. He can get open. He cannot catch. But in a game where he mostly catches the ball, he looks really good. And so you think about how the Giants are set up now, where you have Neighbors, who looks like a potential generational star. You have Wan'Dale, who's maybe the best underneath guy in the NFL. I mean, you're starting to get really serious, Wes Welker, Julian Edelman type of vibes from him. And then you have a complement in Slayton, and you have this emerging running back. I think they're going to be pretty decent. in part because as well, I mean, Daniel Jones is kind of in this weird spot where injuries have been a problem for him, and yet he also understands that his mobility and his feistiness are part of what makes him, again, not top 15, but viable. And he's out there carrying 11 times, throwing his body around like it's not worth anything, right? So this is a guy fighting for his job and using that mobility to make the Giants' offense difficult to deal with. The Giants' offense controlled this game, which is probably the last thing that you expected to ever hear against what has been a pretty interesting defense under new head coach Mike Macdonald, and certainly not something you expected to hear with Malik Neighbors and Devin Singletary out. But it really seemed like the Seahawks had the ball so rarely in this game, and part of that is actually because they have that long touchdown return. You end up getting that sandwiched by these Giants drives that suck play volume out for the Seahawks. And then you have that terrible DK Metcalf fumble. This was the worst game that DK Metcalf had played in a long, long time. He didn't look good as a receiver. He has that bad fumble. Ben and I did the really fun exercise where we project the 2025 first and second rounds. I had him in there at 212. Ben was giving me a little bit of a hard time about it. He didn't look like a 212 pick in this game. With those mistakes, then I do think they panicked a little bit. They got away from the run, as you mentioned, and then they just didn't look that great in the passing game. JSN wasn't involved until that drive he scores on at the end. He seemed pretty disgusted. And then you have the play on the following drive where it's a mistake by both players. He's wide open to convert the third down that would have kept things going for them. And Geno misses him, but he also doesn't get his arms out and make the play with the ball on his hands. It's a catch that you have to make. So the pass has to be better. The catch has to be there. We're still looking for JSN to make the types of plays that would give him a chance to overcome a Metcalf. Now, he does end up as the highest scorer of the Seahawks receivers here, but this is a little bit of a more balanced type of passing game where you get 7 for Metcalf and JSN, you get the 6 for Lockett. In some ways, it's a little bit frustrating, even though we have a lot of exposure to both Walker and to Charbonnet, that they combine for 13 targets. You know, if you're going to have those touches, they're higher value to fantasy managers if they're just the 13 targets as opposed to additional runs. So you kind of balance that out. We want to see Geno look better than he looked in this game.
Yeah, and we'll see if they bounce back, particularly in the running back game. Kenneth Walker did get the receiving work to kind of save his fantasy day. But after what we've seen against the Lions and then what we've seen here, a big change in the direction of that offense. But as I was kind of hitting that earlier with Sam Darnold, and I understand the point that he's going to take you so far, but we do see offenses change from week to week, and then we'll see what stands the test of time over the course of the season. But if you are interested in jumping in that guillotine league with myself and Shawn, reach out overtimeireland@gmail.com or at overtimeireland on Twitter. We will be filling that up over the next 24 hours or so get in touch ASAP. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at overtime. You'll check out all of Shawn's work up on RotoViz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.